Welcome students. I hope you can see the whiteboard in front of you. So this will be a continuation of our last lecture. Like I said, I would be posting a video midweek, but I apologize for being later than midweek. I could not gather the time, that is. So we were doing we were trying to, that is, interpret Hamlet from a Lacanian reading. That is, we were doing a Lacanian reading of desire in Hamlet. So I will continue from where I had left off in the previous class, but of course I will be repeating a few points again. So like I was saying in the last class, that according to Lacan, Hamlet is a tragedy of desire. Now let us try to prove this. So something that I had mentioned in the last class is that desire over here, it means lack. So remember all of the signified that I had taught in the last class. And the female figure or the woman defined in negation, and all of that which I had mentioned explicitly in the last class, and I will not be repeating that. So desire is, according to Lacan, desire is understood as lack, which obviously moves or pushes the subject to want more, that is to fill in that lack, that is to fill in this hole that the subject constantly feels. And the object that causes this desire, is the phallus. So phallus causes the formation of the hole, which is the lack, which is desire. And again, something that I had mentioned in the last class, Lacan did not conceive the phallus as a male organ, and he explains, I'm quoting from the text, so this is what he says, that in the Freudian doctrine, the phallus is not a fantasy, if by that we mean an imaginary effect. So it is not, the phallus does not exist because of an imaginary cause, nor is it such an object, part internal, good, bad, etc., in the sense that this term tends to accentuate the reality pertaining in a relation. That is, it is neither a fantasy, it is not an imaginary existence, nor is it a concrete object which might contribute to the effects that it entails, that might contribute to its definition. It is even less, he says, it is even less the organ, penis or clitoris that it symbolizes. The phallus is a signifier. So remember the entire equation of the signifier that we discussed in the last class. So maybe if later on we have some time left, maybe we will do another analysis of the sign, if time permits us. So moving on, then according to Lacanian theory, the phallus is not a the phallus is not a fantasy, nor is it a partial object, nor a physical organ. It is none of these things. Just a moment. The phallus stands for the signifier. So this then becomes the signifier. Of what? What does it signify? It signifies the omnipotent mother. The ever-present mother. So the phallus stands for the signifier of what the omnipotent mother is also missing, right? We know that the mother is also missing the phallus, which being a signifier in this case signifies patriarchal power, the power of the patriarchal phallus. So the mother also lacks this phallus, and the child relates to this lack, because the child also lacks the phallus symbolically. The child, even if we consider the phallus to be a physical organ, the child lacks the phallus symbolically. That is, the child does not have any power over the mother, which the father has. So both the child and the mother lack the phallus, lack this signifier. So the child relates to this lack, and he can be identified as the object that the mother is missing. The phallus stands for the signifier, signifying what the omnipotent mother is missing. And the child can relate to this lack. And the child then can be identified as the object that the mother is missing. The child wanting to be beside the mother instead of the father, the fundamental Oedipal complex. So there is an intrinsic relationship between the subject of language. Subject of language হতেই হবে, না হলে এই সিগনিফায়ারের খেলাটা এখানে ঢুকবেই না, সাইনের খেলাটা এখানে ঢুকবেই না। ভাষা দিয়ে তার অস্তিত্বটা প্রথম বোঝাতে হবে। Language is the first thing that the child grabs hold onto in order to feature himself within the structure of power. So, there exists an intrinsic relationship between the subject of language and his object of desire, which Laka explains by something that we call, or that something that he calls, the formula of fantasy. I believe this is where we had left off. So he explains, he calls this the formula of fantasy. That is the relationship between the subject of language and the object of desire. Laka represents this relationship by a formula which he calls the formula of fantasy. That is a type of absent persona that rules and structures the subject's life. The phallus, which is a symbol, a signifier, an endless series of signifiers, therefore. So it is not tangibly or concretely present, like the phallus is not a tangible and concrete object. So the formula of fantasy then becomes a type of subjective ghost. Subjective ghost, why subjective? Because it is ব্যক্তিগত ব্যাপারটা. Desire will change according to the person, according to the individual, according to the context. Here we are studying it psychoanalytically. So here the object of desire is obviously the phallus. And here the formula of fantasy therefore becomes a subjective specter or a ghost that rules and structures any subject's life. And Laka says, and I will quote again, Laka says, this is our starting point. Through his relationship to the signifier, the subject is deprived of something himself, that is the phallus, of his very life, which has assumed the value of that which binds him to the signifier. যেটা একটু আগেই বললাম, the omnipotent mother lacks the phallus, the child lacks the phallus, and the child relates to this lack because he thinks that he can be identified as something, as a subject that can fill that hole, that can substitute that lack. So that is what he is saying over here. Through his relationship to the signifier, the subject is deprived of something of himself, of his very life, which has assumed the value of that which binds him to the signifier. The phallus is our term for the signifier of his alienation in signification. When the subject is deprived of this signifier, a particular object becomes for him an object of desire. Fantasy is the pointer of desire, since desire is processed only through fantasy. Here, we have the impossible object of desire, the phallic signifier of lack. In Hamlet, which those are Gertrude and Ophelia. So Gertrude and Ophelia in Hamlet, the text, come to occupy at different levels and under several circumstances this phallic space. This space which Hamlet, the character, wants to fill. Hamlet then becomes a tragedy of desire for three particular reasons. What are those reasons? First, Hamlet does not act in time. He does not act when it is time to act. He is always, quote unquote, delayed due to the dependence of his desire on the desire of the other. So, here again, another important Lacanian concept, something that I had mentioned before, that desire is the desire of the other, which can become the mother, which can become Ophelia in this very particular text. So desire is the desire of the other. And he is delayed because he is dependent upon the desire of the other. His desire is dependent upon the desire of the other, especially the mother's. Second, Ophelia substitutes for Hamlet's phallus, that is what the subject, for in our case the subject is Hamlet. So Hamlet comprised of a lack, which is the phallus, which is a signifier. And Ophelia comes to substitute for this lacking phallus whenever she stands as the lost object that can only be attained when she is dead. So both Gertrude and Ophelia, they come to substitute Hamlet's lacking phallus. And Ophelia comes as a substitute only when she is dead. Because that is what happens in Hamlet. Hamlet truly mourns for Ophelia. She is the one whom he truly mourns for. She is the one whom he truly desires. He realizes that, but only after her death. And very, very symbolically, his mourning takes place exactly in a very concrete representation of a whole. So he mourns for Ophelia in the grave of Ophelia. That is a very symbolic scene. So Ophelia comes to occupy this lacking, this hole in Hamlet's life. Ophelia becomes that phallic object of desire for Hamlet only when she is dead, therefore making her an impossible desire as well. She should not have been an impossible desire because she does not feature in any incestuous relationship. She does not feature in any taboo if Hamlet were to acquire her really. But given all the correct circumstances in which Hamlet should have been able to have Ophelia, He was all too busy, he was all too procrastinating about the ghost, about Claudius, about Gertrude, to think of Ophelia. And only when she goes missing permanently does Hamlet realize that she is the one whom he should have gone for, that she is the one who would have really filled in that hole, keeping in with all societal conventions, keeping in with all social customs, keeping in with all morality and ethicality, because he really cannot acquire the mother, right? He can never do that in any circumstance whatsoever. But with Ophelia, he could have completed this relationship. He could have actually filled that hole, that he does not realize that, or he realizes it too late. Something that I just mentioned, that Hamlet, the text, is a tragedy of desire, because primarily Hamlet does not act in time. So finally, the third reason, that is, mourning is the other theme that is incarnated, that comes up at the end of the play, when Hamlet is able to mourn the loss of this truly acquirable object of desire, that is Ophelia. And the structure of Hamlet is held by, and I'm quoting from Lacan, by his situation of dependence with respect to the desire of the other. Something that I already mentioned. The structure of Hamlet is held by this fact that his desire is dependent upon the desire of the other. Even more, he is truly attached to the desire of his mother. His dependence to her desire, that what does she want? His dependence to her desire keeps Hamlet from choosing between his idealized dead father and the degraded, despicable object Claudius. So Hamlet is constantly wondering, what is my mother's desire? Or more correctly, what does she want from me? That is, what does she want from Hamlet? Consequently, this questioning about the desire of the other or of the mother keeps Hamlet out of action, keeps Hamlet's time out of joint. A very important phrase that Hamlet uses, time is out of joint, he says. So it is his very dependence upon the desire of the mother or desire of the other, that for him, time is out of joint. And it keeps him out of action, since he is constantly ruled by the desire of the other. And in another essay called, just a moment, yes, in another essay called Hamlet, the text that is, and the desire of the mother, written by Jean-Michel Rabate. He says, and I will quote again, he says in this essay that the source of Hamlet's inhibition does not stem from his desire for his mother, but from his own fixation within his mother's desire. The shift from a subjective genitive, where mother's desire means desire for the mother, to an objective genitive, mother's desire as her desire for another man. So here grammatical play has come into action over here. So it has never worked better, he says. It is a dialectical mechanism indeed. Dialectical mechanism as in an antithetical mechanism. indeed, whose flexibility is nevertheless limited, since it refutes the old Oedipian psychology. So it's limited because it refutes the old Oedipian psychology. That is, it is not a desire of or for the mother, but desire of the mother. What does she desire rather than I desire the mother? Laka insists that Hamlet is constantly suspended in the time of the other throughout the entire story until the very end, which is, after all, his time for death. For example, Hamlet is incapable of killing Claudius because he is praying an untimely time to kill him, since it is the hour of the other. He is constantly stuck at the desire of the other, that is. So here Claudius's desire to pray to achieve heaven, and so Hamlet says, now might I do it, that now is praying and now I'll do it. And so it goes to heaven, and so I am revenged. That would be scanned by the gods, that is, and the act of revenge rejected by the gods. Thus the tragedy of Hamlet takes place at the hour of the other, at the exact moment, and until the very end, when it is Hamlet's hour, when it is his time to death, for death, that is. Look at what another psychologist says. John P. Mueller, in Psychosis and Mourning in Laka's Hamlet, says that if Hamlet's action is delayed because it is the hour of the other, because he is subject to the desires of the others, this becomes possible only because he is subject to the signifier of these desires. And this signifier is the phallus. In summarizing it, desire is something that remains outside of the subjective being. It is the desire of others, so it can never be inside of the subjective being. It is the desire of others whose recognition Hamlet seeks, Hamlet wants, looks for, and the desire is linked to the subject who speaks because he has been trapped in the law of language and therefore the law of signifier itself. To this point, Hamlet's essential procrastination or vacillation, that is, and postponement, lies in the field of Gertrude's ambiguous desire. He is dominated by his mother as the big other. That is, the mother being the primordial subject of his desire. The dependence of his desire on the other, it constitutes the permanent dimension of Hamlet's drama. The dependence of this desire on this other, that is, the mother, the other with a capital O. The dependence of his desire on this other constitutes the permanent dimension of Hamlet's drama. Rabate says, I quoted his text before, so you can go back in the video. So Rabate says, Hamlet's inhibition will thus be seen to stem from his archaic desire for the mother, but more because the paralysis derives from his fixation with the riddle of Gertrude's desire for another man, whether his uncle or father. In that sense, according to Laka, Hamlet's enigma, the fact that it constantly acquires a new shape, Hamlet's enigma is Gertrude. Laka affirms that the omnipotence of which, I'm quoting, that the omnipotence of which we are always speaking in psychoanalysis is first of all the omnipotence of the subject as subject of the first demand, In this case, the first subject of the first demand being the mother. And this omnipotence must be related back to the mother, because that is the primordial desire. And in relation to the desire of the mother, Lacan bases his analysis on the moralistic scene, a moralistic scene where Hamlet tries to convince his mother to abandon Claudius. And he says, "Oh, throw away the worser part of it and live the purer with the other half. Good night, but go not to my uncle's bed. Assume virtue if you have it not." So let us see the scene. And as mentioned before, Hamlet is dominated by his mother as the big other. That is the primordial subject of his demand, something that I just mentioned, and I showed you the scene as well. So in this scene, Hamlet cannot accept that the omnipotence of her mother as the first object of his demand is now a woman. A woman, not a mother anymore. And Lacan asserts that Hamlet's mother is a real woman with genital organs who cannot be accepted by her son. She is no longer a symbol. She has become a concrete woman with desires of her own, and Hamlet cannot accept her. He is now overwhelmed by the sexual enjoyment that his mother experiences. He cannot stand that anymore. That is why somehow Hamlet gives up and tells his mother again, and I'm quoting, "Not this by no means that I bid you do, let the bloat king tempt you again to bed, pinch wanton on your cheek, call you his mouse, and let him for a pair of reechy kisses, or paddling in your neck with his damned fingers, make you to ravel all his matter out, that I essentially am not in madness, but mad in craft." And on the other hand, Claudius, Hamlet's incestuous and shameless bandit, according to Hamlet, Claudius exhibits the real phallus, not the symbolic phallus. He stands for the real concrete phallus, which is enjoyed by Gertrude, which represents the adulterous union, which is which Hamlet outrageously makes literal. Now when he says, "Farewell, dear mother," and Claudius says, "Thy loving father, Hamlet," and Hamlet says, "My mother, father and mother is man and wife. Man and wife is one flesh. So my mother." So I will quote this particular dialogue over here for your understanding. Just a moment. Here, "My mother, father and mother is man and wife is one flesh, so my mother." So both of them have turned, for Hamlet, they have turned into real people with real genital organs, where Claudius represents the real phallus, which Claudius, the real tangible woman, enjoys and experiences. Claudius is acting here in this dialogue. You see, they're both substituting each other. Claudius is acting here in place of Gertrude, that is, in the place of the phallus, cause of Hamlet's desire. We can see the terms in which whether Gertrude or Claudius can become that important phallic signifier insofar they desire and have access to what Hamlet has been denied of. Now they become the symbolic phallic signifier only because they have access to what Hamlet has been denied. Between the phallic object, desire and death, Hamlet can only kill Claudius when the act of revenge becomes a kind of retaliation for his own death. And look at what this other critic says. So Stuart Schneiderman, he says, in this respect to what I just mentioned, he says that when he does it, that is when Hamlet acts, it is too late. His act no longer means anything. It no longer has its ethical edge. The murder of Claudius is an afterthought which Hamlet, as Lacan said, can only accomplish when he is dying, when he will not have to bear responsibility for his act. Even more important is that the fact that Hamlet acts when he learns that the wretched Claudius is responsible for Hamlet's impending death. Hamlet can avenge himself because he is an egoist to the end, especially at the end. With his dying breath, he asks Horatio to tell his story. Hamlet is clearly a failure. He cannot act on his desire. He can only perform the act he is obliged to perform when it is no longer his desire. And his success to convince the audience that it is no failure at all, that we can still love him. Lacan's analysis rests in this liaison, in the liaison between Hamlet and Gertrude, and not on Hamlet's desire or Hamlet's relation to Claudius. So Lacan's analysis Lacan does not call it a tragedy because of the death that Hamlet brings upon, the final avenging act that he does. He calls it a tragedy because of his relationship to Gertrude. So the desire of the mother is accountable. That is responsible. What Gertrude desires, that is the ultimate cause for Hamlet's time being out of joint. The signifier of the ultimate inconsistency of the other. That is, the unfathomable or the incomprehensible desire of the other, desire of the mother, the incomprehensible countenance of Gertrude's desire. Therefore, the formula of fantasy marks, it is the absence of some final guarantor or other of the other that could answer the question to every child, that every child addresses to the other. What do you want? And the very inconsistent answer to this question leads to the tragedy. Therefore, making Lacan conclude that it is indeed a tragedy of desire. Now, if Gertrude is the phallic object of Hamlet's desire, Ophelia represents the object that causes his desire, produces, initiates, or even triggers his desire. The object becomes what the subject is symbolically deprived of. The object takes the place of what the subject is, symbolically deprived of. This is what Lacan says. As substitute for the abandoned phallus, this object, that is Ophelia, falls short of actually taking the place of that primal object of desire, that is the mother. Ophelia is not the object of Hamlet's desire. Hamlet's object of desire is always the mother, but rather the object in his desire, the object that causes his desire. As the critic John P. Mueller I mentioned his name before, says it is more proper to speak of Ophelia like the imaginary phallus, as the cause of desire and the lure of being, giving Hamlet a delusion of being more than he is. Ophelia as a site for desire, as a playground on which Hamlet tries to come to terms with his desire, changes along the drama. First in place, Ophelia will become and represent a different object of desire once she dies. Hamlet takes up Ophelia as his smaller object, that is the object in desire, the one that causes or triggers his desire, in three different ways. How does he do that? First, at the beginning of the play, Hamlet experiences certain distance from Ophelia precisely because she represents for him a trigger for his desire. He needs to move away from her because he does not want to know anything about his own desire. This is for Lacan what he calls a moment of estrangement. A very beautiful word, estrangement. So this is the moment which Lacan marks as the moment of estrangement, marked by the distance from the object that Hamlet takes in order to move on to whatever new and henceforth difficult identification, his vacillation in the presence of what has been until now the object of supreme exaltation. That is, as Hamlet tries to negotiate with the primal object of his desire, as Hamlet, the psychoanalyzed subject over here, as he tries to maneuver through the course of attaining or rejecting his desire, he creates his desire as in desire for the mother, the primal desire. He voluntarily estranges himself from the object in his desire, that is Ophelia, which reminds him of his true desire as well as which triggers any sort of desire for him. Therefore, Ophelia is dangerous for Hamlet because Hamlet recognizes the trigger in her. And so, Ophelia says, "He took me by the wrist and held me hard. Then goes he to the length of all his arm, and with his other hand thus over his brow he falls to such perusal of my face as he would draw it. Long stayed he so, for out of doors he went without their helps, and to the last bended their light on me. Once Hamlet said to his beloved, 'I did love you once.'" Hamlet says this in the third act, first scene. "I did love you once." However, in the scene from which I quoted Ophelia, that is the second act and first scene, Hamlet treats Ophelia with derision, with disrespect, cruelty almost. So what kind of love is that? The second manner Hamlet addresses Ophelia as his object of desire is not only in terms of cruelty, aggression, but as the destruction and loss of the object. In this second instance, Ophelia is turned into an object that is not placed, that does not have any symbolic significance, but is real and no longer a part of his unconscious fantasy. At this stage, Ophelia is not Hamlet's object of desire. He rejects her with all the forces of his being. In fact, the certain horror of femininity, that is frailty, thy name is woman, when he says, so the certain horror of femininity that typifies Hamlet's relation to Ophelia, it suggests that if the text is the drama of this dying desire, then Ophelia becomes the only representation of this repudiation of desire, rejection of desire. that is. Therefore, Ophelia is, Lacan says, at this point the phallus, externalized, exteriorized and rejected by the subject, that is Hamlet, as the very symbol of the rejection of his desire. That is how he treats Ophelia. That is why he treats Ophelia in the way that he does. Because he rejects her as the object of desire. The third way in which Hamlet sees Ophelia as the object that causes his desire is clear in the scene of the graveyard, where he says, I loved Ophelia. 40,000 brothers could not with all their quantity of love make up my sum. What wilt thou do for her? According to this third equation, then, it can be witnessed that there is a certain reignition, a reintegration of the object that Hamlet wins back at the price of mourning and death. Because death is irredeemable, you cannot turn back the clock on death. Ophelia is reincorporated as Hamlet's object of desire. So this is why I was saying that Hamlet's desire is of impossible desire, and he obsesses about it. He replaces, that is, places Ophelia as his object of desire only when she is dead, that is, when she is reincorporated as Hamlet's object of desire. For Lacan, the graveyard scene is directed towards that furious battle at the bottom of the tomb, in which the object of Hamlet's desire is in fact a dead object, Ophelia, who makes him a subject capable of desiring something that is absolutely unattainable. And therefore Lacan says, and I am quoting again, only insofar as the object of desire has become an impossible object can it become once more the object of his desire. The obsessional neurotic sets everything up so that the object of his desire becomes the signifier of this impossibility. Otherwise, how can Hamlet continue on with his obsession if he really does attain what he wants to? So according to Lacan, Hamlet desires as an obsessional neurotic insofar he can only desire at the very crossroads of imminent life and death, right in the premises of impossibility. The horror of femininity is present throughout the play according to the establishment of a boundary, of a frontier between the characters of Ophelia, the virgin, and Gertrude, the incestuous whore. These are the two types which Hamlet encounters. And the horror of femininity is installed throughout the play in order to establish a frontier between these characters. Both female characters embody the drama of the feminine object, trapped in this masculine snare of desire. As far as both women are at the same time the object and the hallmark of desire, the object of desire, Gertrude, and the object in desire, Ophelia. But also the phallus. Both of them symbolize both of these things. In fact, the object of Hamlet's desire can become his object of desire to the extent that the object is lost, absent. The impossible neurosis that he has. Lacan affirms, and I quote, that the very structure at the basis of desire always lends a note of impossibility to the object of human desire. And that is true even in the Freudian sense. For if a man is to desire continuously the mother, which he can never really acquire, and if man stands for humanity, the entire world then desires something that it really cannot have. And are we not actually, all of us, participants in that race to acquire things that we do not have, to acquire more that we do not have, even more that we do not have. Therefore, the only way, coming back to the subject, that is, the only way a subject can accept and process his object of desire is through loss and mourning. In a way, the enigma of Hamlet, that is the Hamlet machine, is also set as a drama of mourning and loss. After the graveyard fight with Laertes, Hamlet says, and I quote, "But sure the bravery of his grief did put me into a towering passion." In this sense, the death of Ophelia releases a gap, a hole that is opened in the sight of the real hole, the real graveyard. Hamlet introduces this relationship between death and emptiness or loss when he is in the graveyard for Ophelia. And he says, "Imperious Caesar, dead and turned to clay, might stop a hole to keep the wind away. Oh, that the earth which kept the world in awe should patch a wall to expel the winter's flaw." In fact, Hamlet the text, stands as a drama about what really endures when the symbols collapse, when the symbolic order collapse. Imagine waking up to a world where everything that represented something to you vanished, poofed in the air. What would you have done? So the main collapse abides in the play as Hamlet's failure to mourn, that is his absolute failure to mourn the loss of the phallus. Ophelia's death as well becomes a ritual sacrifice for Hamlet in purgation of the unmourned loss of his father, which, I quote from Lacan, attempts to institute a lack that can be adequately mourned. The object of desire is then constructed through mourning and death. The real object of desire is consequently structurally dead, so the subject can only desire when the object is absent, fundamentally dead. Something that I said just right before this. Here, desire does not mean yearning, wanting, but nostalgia. Nostalgia for the object that is constantly drifting and shifting, like signifiers always do. In the end, the phallus is that primordial mourned object whose loss is repeated in all of the forthcoming losses that Hamlet experiences, in all the forthcoming subjective experience of lack, mourning, and physical grief. Hamlet the play is certainly one where all anyone talks about is mourning. So the phallus as a signifier is evoked throughout, and Lacan says the phallus is everywhere present in the disorder in which we find Hamlet each time he approaches one of the crucial moments of his action. And in this game of desire, the phallus can never be eliminated because, as Hamlet's father, the ghost is nothing and does not exist, so it cannot be eliminated. Hamlet the drama stands as an example of the perplexity of all human beings. We are all trapped in the webs of desire and we cannot abscond from them. The enigma of Hamlet is our own enigma as well. That is, we are subjected beings in lack, fundamentally divided, always desiring an object which does not exist, the phallus. For instance, in the case of Ophelia, Hamlet does not want to accept he loves her when she is alive. He declares it to Laertes when she is already dead, in the cemetery, deep in the dying hole. Hamlet desires Ophelia given that she is not there anymore and she is absent. Lack opens up the road to desire. Lack makes us desire. The object which causes desire, the smaller object that originates desire, is the phallus. That is the primordial signifier. That is why Lacan proposes for Hamlet, Ophelia is Ophallus. And that is why he also says that Hamlet is, in reality, a tragedy of desire. So that is it. Come up with any questions if you will have them in the next class. Thank you very much.